Okay, Barak, thanks for making some time. We've gone back a few years when we were at MuleSoft and you were the virtual CISO. And in my mind, of course, there's many claims to this, and many people can claim it. But from my experience and from what I know, and I know a lot of people, you seem to be the first virtual CISO that there is. So that's pretty cool. And you've started a practice around this. So first, tell me about the evolution that led you to becoming a virtual CISO and a little bit of that journey, please.
Sure. The concept was actually 20 years ago. I got out of my last full-time corporate job, and thank you for inviting me, by the way. And starting to figure out how to build a consulting practice for myself, and had the either suicidal or brilliant, depending on the time frame, I think, idea, because back at that time, security was one of those four-letter words that nobody wanted to learn how to spell. And that there's going to be a lot of companies that are going to need a security program without the overhead expense administrative nightmare of having a full-fledged security department. And so that really is the origination. The term CISO didn't exist at the time. Like, there was no such thing as a chief information security officer. And so I started selling this idea of a virtual CISO, chief security officer, which these days actually talks about the guys that run data center security, all the physical security aspects of companies that have physical infrastructure to protect. And then in, I want to say 2008, 2009, something like that, I was interviewed by one of the handful of journalists, one of those rare breeds that actually know what they're writing about. And Evan Schumann, he was at the time, I think he was running something called Storefront Backtalk, which was a very popular newsletter in the retail industry. And he interviewed me for something, and he's the one who suggested to me, do you realize, like, I looked it up, I did some research before we were talking, you realize you're the first person that has ever used that term, virtual CISO? I'm like, no, I have no idea. I didn't even think it was particularly important, because it's not like something that anybody even was talking about until in the last few years. But as in the last few years, this term is becoming a lot more popular, and people are still trying to kind of figure out what it means. I'm realizing now in the look back of 20 years that maybe it's worth at least saying, hey, it seems like I may have been the first one to have done so. So that's really where that claim comes from.
Yeah.
I blame Evan.
But that's interesting, right? Because the term didn't really exist, and I agree with you. The term, the title, Chief Security Information Officer or Chief Security Officer. But so, in your perspective, just walk me through, because it wasn't like security was not a concern back in the day when this term wasn't there. So just give me a quick synopsis on the last, I guess, 3 decades of how security and this topic of security has evolved. That's led us to needing this title.
Right. Let me take you back to the olden days of the 1980s. And where computing was becoming a thing on the level of accessible to a single user, right? If you remember the Apple II, I had a 2E at my, that's actually where I learned all my skills on initially. And companies were starting to use them. And then you started hearing this vision, right? And this is the classic hype chart. You've seen that thing that I think Gartner put out, right? You have the hype, and then you have like the trough of disillusionment, and then right, and it takes decades. That's when they started talking about the paperless office. I mean, as early as the late 80s, if I recall correctly. And that was before like the internet became a huge thing. That was about the time I was there in the first Usenet war, flame war. Anyhow, well, it's taken 30 years for this to become reality. You now have companies that are called like the cloud first or cloud only companies that have no paper, no printers even, everything is in the cloud and whatever, but it's taking a long time. And in that context, back in the day, you had the title of CIO, right? Chief Information Officer, that became popular right around that time, that turn of that decade. But what did it mean? right? It meant usually a system administrator with a fancy title. I mean, let's be fair, that's how it started. There weren't CIOs running around back in the 70s because that wasn't a thing for the most part, at least not in the context that we mean today. Similarly, in security, we're sort of 20 years behind, but on the same path. So we're now getting into this stage where it's recognized that security is some form of business discipline. I think most people still misunderstand it. But everybody is clear that it is something that's important. Most people are afraid of it, just like they were of technology in general at the time, right? But they're all realized that it's essential to the business. And so we're kind of like in this part of the cycle where you start getting folks that may come from a technology discipline. Maybe they were like a really clever network administrator or a good political, application development guy or whatever it might be, and say, hey, can you do security? You seem to know a little bit of what you're talking about. We need security. Let's, give you a title of Chief Information Security Officer, which we've heard about, and you manage this stuff, right? We're kind of like in that same stage as those system administrators that became CIOs back in the 90s, because everybody is realizing, again, that security is a critical business discipline. However, we have a significant part of this path to still tread before we another 20 years at least before it becomes truly like the same thing as CIOs are today, essential business function and part of the executive leadership committee. In fact, we still have the trough of disillusionment to walk through, and that's going to happen in 10 years.